At 11 a.m. on September 3, 1939, World War II officially began and all treaties limiting aircraft carrier construction ended. With the fall of mainland Europe, which allowed U-boats to range further into the Atlantic, it became clear that what was needed was numerous small carriers. Suddenly, in a dramatic about-face, numbers were more important than being cheaper per plane, per ton, or total tonnage. These auxiliary or escort carriers could provide air cover for convoys as they crossed the U-boat-infested Atlantic, transport planes, and train pilots. Most were built in the U.S. Except for the tanker types, high-performance aircraft couldn't operate from them due to their small size. As a result, they had to use fighters with low stall speeds, such as the Wildcat. Given their small air group size, the only rational choice for an attack plane was the hugely versatile Avenger. Sometimes they could only be launched with the catapult. Another advantage of both types, being Grumman designs, was that their wings could fold back against their body, giving them a smaller storage footprint than planes whose wings folded upward. Once the U.S. went on the offensive, a new role emerged for the baby flat top or Jeep carrier, assault carrier. While the fleet carriers often provided distant cover for invasions and stood by to engage the Japanese fleet if it tried to interfere, the escort carriers remained near the landing beaches to provide close air support. This meant using attack planes with bombs or depth charges to hunt subs or surface ships that might try to attack the invasion force. Fighters were used to intercept enemy aircraft. Both were used to attack enemy troops opposing the amphibious landing. CVEs were jacks of all trade. It wouldn't be uncommon for an escort carrier to leave port carrying replacements aircraft for the fleet or ferrying land-based planes, escorting an outbound convoy along the way. They would then provide close air support during an invasion, then return to port with an inbound convoy while carrying damaged aircraft that needed deep repair or air groups cycling back for R&R. The early escort carriers were conversions of merchant cargo ships, at first ones already completed and then ones still under construction. As production ramped up, escort carriers were purpose-built, though the designs were still based on merchants. The best were the ones based on tankers, since they were larger, which made them steadier ships, sturdier, and designed with heavier weights in mind, giving them more reserve buoyancy. The early ones were originally designated AVGs, Auxiliary Tender, Heavier Than Air Aircraft, General Purpose. This reflected their original role of transporting aircraft. Ones built with the intention of transferring to Britain were designated as BAVGs. On August 20th of 1942, they were redesignated ACVs, Auxiliary Carriers, reflecting their role as support carriers. Then, on July 15, 1943, they were redesignated again as CVEs, escort carriers. Post-war, the survivors were essentially put in some form of reserve, with a few returning for Korea. Throughout the following decades, most would be redesignated many times. Helicopter escort carriers, or CVHEs, utility carriers, or CVUs, and auxiliary cargo aircraft transports, or AKVs, were the most common designations. The first escort carrier converted by the U.S. was the 13,342-ton Long Island. Her near sister, which never received a U.S. name, was transferred to the British upon completion of conversion, so I'll deal with her whenever I get to the Royal Navy. Originally built and completed as a standard C-3 type cargo ship, she was acquired by the Navy in March of 1941 and began a conversion that lasted until being commissioned June 2, 1941. The conversion was very austere, turnaround time being the priority rather than quality. In fact, her conversion took less than 3 months. She came out somewhat comparable to the first carrier, Langley, of nearly 20 years prior. She had no island, the ship being helmed from the original bridge under the forward end of the flight deck. She also had only one propeller. Like all escort carriers, there was no armor worth speaking of. At best, splinter shielding. The flight deck was supported by a lattice work and ran about 3/4 the length of her hull from the bridge aft. The hangar was a light structure built on the main deck, running from the bridge aft. The forward two-third was an open structure, with the rear part being enclosed. Due to her limited abilities, she served virtually exclusively in a training and transport role. Not a glorious role, but a very important one, and she proved herself quite useful in it. Main armament was one 5-inch 51 caliber single open-mounted gun at the stern. Two 3-inch 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns in single open mounts were carried side by side at the bow. Propulsion was provided by 4 diesel engines venting to one small port-side midship funnel cranked out the side that provided 8,500 horsepower to one shaft for a top speed of 17.5 knots. She used one rudder. The flight deck was 360 feet by 70 feet and had one port-side catapult. The single elevator was 38 feet by 34 feet and was awkwardly located just aft of midship. The hangar was 98 feet long by 54 feet wide by 17.5 feet high. Aircraft complement was operationally about 16, but she could and did transport many more than that at times. Modifications were light. By September of 1941, it was accepted her flight deck was too short, so it was lengthened to 418 feet, and navigation outriggers were fitted outboard of the flight deck on either side of the now topped-off bridge. Subdivision was also improved to enhance survivability. In February of 1944, with better escort carriers available, she was reduced to purely an aircraft transport. This meant, while she kept her catapult for launching, her arresting wires and thus the ability to land aircraft was removed. Her 5-inch 51 caliber was also replaced with a 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose gun in a single open mount. Radar and light AA was also improved. Long Island was in the Atlantic training carrier pilots when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The first few months were spent escorting convoys and training before transferring to the Pacific in mid-May of 1942. Arriving at the West Coast in early June, she provided air support and scouting for the battleships there and continued pilot training, eventually moving to Pearl Harbor in July. At the start of August, she began transferring Marine aircraft to Guadalcanal. Returning to the West Coast in late September, she spent most of the rest of the war training pilots at the West Coast and ferrying aircraft to forward bases as the U.S. advanced through the Pacific. Post-war, she was sold back to merchant service in mid-April of 1946, where, after changing hands several times, she was eventually scrapped in 1977.